this fall, because of a unique circumstance in our family, I ventured to El Salvador, which for a person who didn't speak really any Spanish at all was quite a journey. And it was clear in the sort of halting conversations I had with the very generous and incredibly patient folks who welcomed us there that a lot of my life experience didn't really translate. My career was sort of hard to explain, my ethnic background kind of confusing, my hobbies bizarre. But when I mentioned that I was from the Bronx, instantly there was a light of recognition because that was a part of their experience too. And what I realized both on that trip and even more so when I came home and looked at the world around me there and here in Brooklyn and saw things that seemed suddenly familiar from my trip to the rest of the Americas, I realized that it wasn't so much that I had left my world to go to a different one, but that I had always been dwelling in a part of the Spanish-speaking world, the Latino world. And I think what we're going to try to do tonight here is understand more about that world as it has evolved in Brooklyn, what its contours and characteristics are. So we'll hear from our esteemed panel for a while, and then we'll open it up to questions. And so please think of interesting things to ask. I'm very pleased to be joined tonight by three people. To my immediate left is the Commissioner of the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, Nisha Agarwal, who is an accomplished public interest lawyer and a leading voice in immigration reform at the local and national level. She led the development and implementation of ID NYC, the country's largest municipal identification program, and was an instrumental force in the creation of Action NYC, an initiative that provides free, safe immigration legal help to every immigrant New Yorker in their community and in their language. Prior to taking her current post, she was the co-founder and deputy director of the Center for Popular Democracy, and before that, she served as director of the Health Justice Program at New York Lawyers for the Public Interest. Welcome, Commissioner. I'm also joined to my right by Dr. Laird Bergad, who is a distinguished professor of Latin American and Caribbean history in the Department of Latin American and Puerto Rican Studies at Lehman College, in my neighborhood in the Bronx, and the PhD program in history at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. A member of CUNY's faculty since 1980, Professor Bergad is the founding and current director of the CUNY Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latino Studies. Welcome, Professor. And over there on the far left, only geographically, not politically, I'm not really,
or both.
Or both even, yeah, sure, that's cool.
I'll take it.
Is Javier H. Valdes, who is the co-executive director of Make the Road New York, MRNY, the largest community-based immigrant organization in New York State. Javier oversees MRNY's work in the areas of civil rights, education, housing, environmental justice, immigration, and youth organizing. In 2013, President Barack Obama awarded him the White House Champions of Change Cesar Chavez Award for his work to support immigrant communities. Previously, he served as the Director of Advocacy at the New York Immigration Coalition, led the Immigrant Advocacy Fellowship, and was the Program Officer for Latin America at the Synergos Institute. Welcome, Javier. And we're going to start tonight, because we have a professor here, with a brief, I wouldn't say lecture, but look at some of the numbers to describe Brooklyn's amazing Latino populations. Professor.
All right, so what I'm going to present here are data. They're not designed to put you to sleep. They're not designed to bore you. The data tell a story, and it's the story of how the Latino communities in Brooklyn have grown since 1980, based on data from the census. So it's the story that counts. Let's take a look at some of the data here. We're just going to look at some basic demographic data. I only have about 7 or 8 minutes to speak, so you have to bear with me. This indicates the growth of the Latino population of Brooklyn between 1980 and 2004. You can see that back in 1980 we had about 420,000 Latinos. That increased to 525,000. But that the percentage of the total population of Brooklyn comprised by Latinos has not changed very much. It was close to 19% in 1980. It's 20% today. So, or in the latest data released in 2014. So we have an expanding community, numerically speaking, but as a percentage of all inhabitants, it hasn't changed very much. Brooklyn Latinos as a percentage of the city's Latino population. Back in 1980, Brooklyn had the largest contingent of Latinos in the city, and that accounted for you can see 28.4%, and that gradually declined to where it is today, so that not only are 20% of Brooklyn's inhabitants Latinos, but of all Latinos in the city, about 21% live in Brooklyn, and Brooklyn is third behind the Bronx and Queens. So you can see this this decreasing percentage of all Latinos in the city. Neighborhoods where Latinos are concentrated. This map is from 2014 data. These are census tracts. I won't overwhelm you. They simply show the darker colors, concentrations of Latinos, and I think every Brooklynite knows precisely where Latinos are concentrated in the borough, in Bushwick, in Sunset Park, to a lesser extent in Williamsburg, at Woodhaven, and Seagate, Coney Island. So this is where Latinos are concentrated, although Latinos live everywhere in the borough. All Latinos are not the same. And now let's look at Latino nationalities. And so we see that the biggest contingent of Latinos in 2014 are Puerto Ricans. Mexicans are second, which may be somewhat surprising given the configuration of Latino populations in other boroughs, and that's because of the meteoric growth of the Mexican population. Dominicans are third, et cetera, et cetera. Now, here's the percentage of all New York City Mexicans, Puerto Ricans, and Dominicans that live in Brooklyn. So you can see that nearly a third of all Mexicans in the city live in Brooklyn. And for Puerto Ricans, it's a quarter. For Dominicans, it's considerably less, as the Dominican population is concentrated principally in the Bronx and Upper Manhattan. The Puerto Rican population of Brooklyn has constantly declined from 1980, and we can see that here, from 287,000 down to 180,000, and as a percentage of all Latinos, once to be a Latino in Brooklyn almost was synonymous with being Puerto Rican. Nearly over 2/3 of Latinos in Brooklyn were Puerto Rican in 1980. That has declined to a third in 2014, and I might say that this is the way many other places in the city are going. Nativity, I think, is important. Today, or most recently, 3/4 of all Puerto Ricans who live in Brooklyn were born in the United States. And that has all kinds of cultural implications with respect to language, with respect to access to education. Only 25%, and I might add that this 25% who was born on the island today is much older population. So if you looked at the younger population, those under 40, you would find that over 90% were in fact born in the United States. Mexican population, you can see how the Mexican population has soared in the borough. Only 2% or 2.2% of all Latinos in Brooklyn in 1980, now approaching a quarter of all Latinos in the borough. So we saw that Mexicans were the second largest national subgroup of Latinos in Brooklyn. You can see certainly why. Dominican population also has increased significantly over this time period, increasing by a factor of almost 4. I thought it would be interesting to look at the birthplace of non-Puerto Rican Latinos. And here we find the impact of immigration. We can see that the majority of Latinos born, residing in Brooklyn were born in their countries of origin or outside. That is changing. You can see that increasingly more and more non-Puerto Rican Latinos were born in the United States. That will also continue to increase. If we looked at the younger sector, if I was to slice and dice this data by age, you would see the younger people are almost all born in the United States. A few socioeconomic indicators about the Latino population, if my 8 minutes aren't up yet. They are education, I think, is something that's worthwhile examining as sort of a broad indicator of how Latinos are faring. Now, astounding to see, and this is for adult population 25 years of age and older, that's how the Census Bureau measures educational attainment. Astounding to see back in 1980, 86% of all Latinos living in the borough had not graduated high school. All right. These were recent immigrants, Puerto Ricans and other groups, and they simply did not have access to education. The college graduation rate, you can see, has increased impressively. It's not as high as non-Hispanic whites. You can see at the note below that 53% of Brooklyn's non-Hispanic whites have graduated college. 23% of Brooklyn's non-Hispanic blacks have graduated college. 33% of Asians have graduated college. Latinos, 16%, the lowest college graduation rate. That's the bad news. The good news is that things are improving. The good news is that the curve is upward, that more and more people are going to college. So it's a glass half full, glass half empty kind of situation. And by the same token, the number, the percentage of Latinos who have not graduated high school has declined markedly over the last 30 some years. Citizenship. 80% of Latinos who live in Brooklyn are citizens. All right. And that's slightly down from what it was when Latinos were Puerto Ricans, who are all citizens by birth. Right? But still, the vast majority of Latinos living in Brooklyn are, in fact, citizens of the United States. Poverty, another indicator of social status. We can see that poverty is a very serious problem, and I have not mentioned childhood poverty, where the rates are much higher. But you can see that poverty rates have steadily declined in Brooklyn between 1980 and 2014, and those not in poverty have continually increased. This does not take into account people who live in near poverty or near impoverished conditions. Income. This is in inflation-adjusted dollars. We can see that there's been a gradual rise of median household income among Latinos in the borough. And again, this is inflation-adjusted, so it takes into account cost of living. It has not been very impressive, quite frankly, between 1990 and 2014. If we looked at this same curve for non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks, it would have been much, much, much higher. Last thing I'm going to look at is English language abilities. And this is very interesting because of what's coming up in the next slide. As you can see that most Latinos have declared that they speak English well, or very well, or only English. And that is consistent with the fact that over 70% of Latinos are citizens, and a high proportion of Latinos were born in the United States. However, when we ask what language is spoken at home, the dominant language is Spanish. 80% of Latinos reported in 2014 speaking Spanish at home. Simply what this indicates is that bilingualism, an ability to speak English outside the home, yet maintenance of Spanish language, seems to be the norm among Brooklyn's Latino population. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor. We could probably do a panel about each of those slides, and perhaps we'll ask for permission to do that. But Commissioner, I wanted to go to you with a kind of an overall question that seems to lead into, which is, we have seen Brooklyn become less Puerto Rican, more Dominican, more Mexican. That could be read as an indication that the Latino experience in Brooklyn has become increasingly an immigrant experience, but also we see that a larger percentage of Latinos are being born here in the US. So I wonder, in terms of your day job, do you feel as though Latino Brooklyn is becoming more or less of an immigrant population? And whatever that change is, how does that affect their relationship with the city and the kind of services that they need from it?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you so much for having me here. It's great to be on this panel. I thought the data were fantastic, so thank you. You know, I think the way, certainly our approach at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs tends to be on the immigrant lens to things. And certainly if you look at some of the neighborhoods like Sunset Park, like Bushwick, it sort of over time you have seen an increase in immigrant Latino New Yorkers. And so I do think that resonates, at least with our experience on the ground. I think the slide I was actually really interested in was one of the first ones that just showed the growth in the Latino population from, I think, 1990 to today, or to 2010. And I think the way in which, at least I think about that trend line, is also if we then plotted the kind of organizational development of Latino organizations like Make the Road and others, right? As that trend line was going up, we also saw the growth of organizations that were focused on organizing in the community and then in engaging city government and doing sort of other kinds of activism that I think has really helped shape Immigrant New York in important ways. And obviously it's a range of different communities that have contributed to those victories and those efforts, but I do think that the growth of Latino New York, and that includes Brooklyn, has really set up the architecture that we now benefit from today in the mayor's office. We benefit in ways that are just the kind of increased political engagement and sophistication of many of these groups has led to the election of my boss and to a really progressive speaker of the city council who also cares very much about immigrant communities. What we've been able to do in the last couple of years are things like creating an IDNYC municipal ID card program that now has more than 830,000 people who've signed up for this card. Right? And when all of those kinds of programs and policies don't just happen in a vacuum because the mayor and the speaker think they're a good idea, it's the sort of advocacy from the community that really helps to drive it. And so I think that's sort of the story I think it's important to highlight alongside the data, and certainly is what we experience every day in our work.
Javier, I'm curious, the changes that we've seen in the composition of Brooklyn's Latino population over the decades, do you feel that that has changed the kind of work you do or made elements of it more or less important or more or less challenging in terms of the population changing, nation of origin, where they were born, what their citizenship status is coming in? I mean, how has that made your job different?
So again, thank you for having me today. I work in one of those red dots in the map. I work in Bushwick. My organization has been there for 20 years. And I think just speaking the story of Bushwick, I think we can talk about the difference in the Latino population there in itself. I think one thing sometimes that I always kind of look at is there's 3 Latino elected officials in the city council in Brooklyn, and the 3 of them are 2 Dominican and 1 Mexican, and I just feel like it's also talking a little bit about the power shift that's happening in the city among those populations as they're going out and getting bigger and then going into elected office. I would just say that I think the thing that I find the most beautiful about the Latino population in Brooklyn and all of New York is that the level of solidarity among the primarily Puerto Ricans who are U.S. citizens to the other Latino communities. I think that has been something that there's not been that much tension, I would say. Of course, there's things that people fight over, but overall it's been one of like, how do we kind of elevate our broader constituency? And I think we've been able to see that on immigration reform. Probably the strongest champion for that issue is Congresswoman Nydia Velázquez from Williamsburg, Bushwick, and Sunset Park as a Puerto Rican. And I think that's, I think we're an example to the national stage about how Latino population can come together around issues that we all care about and do some work together. And then the other thing is that I would just invite you all, just 3 blocks from here at the Brooklyn Borough Hall, we have a public exhibit that you can see. We have some banners hanging from the Borough Hall, and then an exhibit internally that kind of shows the faces of Brooklyn Latinos that would benefit from President Obama's executive action. And then you get to kind of see the humanity of those people that are your residents, are your neighbors, that would benefit from immigration reform. It's a beautiful exhibit. It's up for the next month, and I welcome all of you to see it. So I'll leave it there. And then
your mention of solidarity, I think, is really interesting because one of the pitfalls I try to avoid as the privileged white male from central casting is to look at a group that's different and assume that that everyone who is lumped into that group shares some common political opinion or religious orientation. And I'm wondering, Professor, looking a little deeper into the socioeconomic data, which I'm sure you have, are there significant differences in terms of the experience, be it education, language tradition, income, among the different Latino subgroups, or are they more or less all traveling on the same trend?
No. There's no such thing as the same trend. There are enormous differences by gender. There are enormous differences by nationality. Generally, when we look at educational attainment levels, women graduate from college at a much, much higher rate than men. Among some groups, the numbers are astounding. And again, I don't want to bore you with numbers. If we examine Andeans, which are not Colombians, Ecuadorians, Peruvians, we find that adult Colombian, Peruvian, and Ecuadorian women have college graduation rates that are about the same as non-Hispanic whites. We find, however, when we look at Puerto Ricans, the dominant group, even though it's declined, we have the lowest level of college graduation, although it is higher among Puerto Rican women than it is among Puerto Rican men, and the same thing is true with Dominicans, unfortunately. Mexicans, the more recent arrivals, also tend to have lower educational attainment levels. So certainly, there's no homogeneity here. Although there may be solidarity, there may be the absence of conflicts, there are different socioeconomic performances.
I guess that kind of raises two questions. What do we attribute that to? And does that create challenges for maintaining that solidarity around policies that folks want, or designing policies to help this community? I mean, does that create an issue?
So, like, I can only speak from the experience of Make the Road New York. Make the Road represents predominantly Latino immigrant population. Of course, it's not monolithic and it's very diverse. And like, I interact with people from all the geographies that the professor has laid out. And I think there's a lot of differences among those constituencies, not only from place of origin, but also on language. A lot of them do not even speak Spanish as their first language, while some of them speak an indigenous language first. But there's a lot of issues that kind of bring us together, right? So the issue of education as a parent is one that a lot of people connect to, either if you're an Ecuadorian or a Mexican or a Dominican in Bushwick. That issue is primarily critical. The issue of housing is impacting those constituencies the same. So I think that the more that we can find areas of common ground and really think about policies that are, break through and support all of them, the better we are. And I think that in working with Nisha and the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs, we found that in the IDNYC, we wanted to do something that not only benefited the immigrant community across the board, but also allowed us to build bridges to non-immigrant community that also needed the support. Yeah,
and I would sort of add to that, again, building off of sort of the IDNYC example, that I think often in immigration, there's we'll create policies that tend to focus on just one group or another, or immigrants and not others. And I think there's a lot of opportunity to build more kind of universal programs and policies that can then actually shape the nature of the conversation and the solidarity that happens, right? So through IDNYC, the real focus initially was the undocumented population who can't get other forms of government ID in New York and in the United States right now. But we wanted to make sure it was a program that everybody took advantage of, so that it wasn't just the ID card for the undocumented. And so that was a range of different benefits. It was even things like making the ID card double as your library card. Now, why is that important? We've had a huge response from the immigrant community, but we've also had a huge response from non-immigrants. And what that means is it's sort of showing a sort of way that policy can also help shape solidarity, where this is not the thing for them over there, but it's actually something that makes us all New Yorkers, and it's sort of symbolic of all New Yorkers. And I think good organizing does that. I think good policy making can do that. And I think it's something we have to sort of start grappling with more, whether we're making policy or we're on the ground doing organizing and providing services. Sort of how do we create some of those bridges?
How they're created, and also, I guess, where they're created is another question. The map that was part of the presentation of where Latino Brooklyn is concentrated, I wonder how that has changed over the past 10 years. I mean, I think Bushwick, clearly a neighborhood where there is the perception of change, the fear that change is coming, real change on the ground. So have we seen Latino Brooklyn shrink or move within the map of Brooklyn? Are we seeing areas that were once dominated by one national group becoming more diverse? I mean, what would that map look like if we were to see it 10 or 20 years ago, Professor?
Well, I think it would reflect the national composition of the Latino population. In other words, when Puerto Ricans were close to 70% of all Latinos, the map would look very different. Neighborhoods would look very different. We can go all the way back to the early 20th century when Red Hook was the epicenter of Latino settlement, and this was mostly Puerto Ricans with some Cubans. So I think the map changes along with arrival of different immigrant groups that populate different areas. Now, with respect to different communities, was Sunset Park always a center of Latino settlement? I'm not sure because I haven't looked at the data from the 1960s or 1970s. Certainly has been since the 1980s. But you would probably know more about that.
Yeah, I think Bushwick, since the big fire and since then, like it's been predominantly Latino population, a lot of Puerto Ricans. The Puerto Rican population that we interact with, just from anecdotal experience from some of our members, a lot of them are moving to Allentown and Reading, Pennsylvania. It seems to be like the level of displacement of the Latino population in Bushwick because of gentrification and the economic forces is high. So there's a couple of things that are happening. Because we do have public housing, there are some people in the community that are anchored there for long term and are able to be part of the changes, but a lot of them are doubling or tripling up in the neighborhood, migrating either to East New York or to Canarsie, or leaving the city in its entirety. We have seen a lot of that, and in the large, I would say, anecdotally again, the Ecuadorian Dominican population, as in our base, has increased drastically over the last 10 years in comparison to the first 10 years.
One of the things that a person like me, I guess I'm a fourth or fifth generation American, the fact that I don't even know means my folks have been here for a long time, is trying to understand how viable and how ubiquitous the connections between people who are living in New York and their home countries are, whether it's where they actually came from or where their parents came from. And when you see news like the Ecuador earthquake this week, when you hear obviously about the Puerto Rican debt crisis, you wonder, how do we characterize those connections? I mean, people moving back and forth, do events in the rest of the Spanish-speaking world affect people here in a direct way? Do we see that? How does that play out?
The earthquake in Ecuador is devastating, impacted a lot of people. Right now, currently, as we speak, we're doing a big vigil in Bushwick with the large Ecuadorian population and the broader Latino population calling to attention. The same is happening tomorrow in Corona. So that happens all the time. I think Nisha and I can, and most of us that are in the room that are immigrants, can share about what I call is like living in the hyphen. And the reason I say that is like, I'm Argentine, and I'm also American, and I'm neither, right? Like when I go to Argentina, I'm the gringo, I'm the American, and when I'm here, I'm the Argentine Latino, and I feel like we're the group that lives in the hyphen, right? So I'm Argentine American, but in reality, I'm that bridge between those two populations, and I think we know how to navigate both. Like I can, and I think my experience and a lot of the younger generation people that are grown up in the United States and in New York know how to navigate. So like, of course, in my house, we spoke Spanish, but externally, I had a whole different personality and a whole different thing. Like, it's like, to my immigrant parents, I was like the do-good, etc. And that's, outside of the household, we might have a whole different personality of how I behaved or acted. So I think that's true to most of the experience of the immigrant population, Latino or not, in the city or in the United States.
I think that's absolutely right. I mean, we, just as an example, we're taking the train down here, and I was chatting with Eileen, who's on the Moya team, about what's happening in Puerto Rico, right? And she's passionate about it because her family's Puerto Rican, and there's this connection the same way that I feel very connected to things that may happen in India, but then there's also ways that you can actually see it numerically, right? So the amount of remittances that are sent back to home countries by immigrants of all backgrounds is tremendous, in some cases actually lifting up entire national economies through those remittances. And so I think those connections are deep, even if they don't necessarily mean that people are going back and forth or traveling back to home countries as much. I think that description of sort of living in the hyphen is very real, and it's something that certainly in our role at the Mayor's Office of Immigrant Affairs we have to be attuned to. So if there's an earthquake in Ecuador, we can't just say there was an earthquake in Ecuador. We know there's a huge community here who's affected, and that it's partly our responsibility to make sure city government is responding as it needs to. So I think those are the kinds of things that really matter when you're, even if you're in a city government, but thinking about immigrant communities.
Yeah, I think, you know, about 2 decades ago, scholars pioneered the notion of transnational communities. That is, communities which transcend nations. And of course, the revolution in communications has facilitated that. What's up? What's up is a staple in all of Latin America. And anyone can, I mean, this binds people together. It's possible to speak on a continual basis during any day of the week with a whole number of people who are family members, and that kind of solidifies this whole notion of transnational communities. Now, having said that, there's also another phenomenon. Irrespective of communication, the more recent arrivals are going to have stronger ties with their countries of origin than people who've been here for a long time. So I find, and forgive me, but I've taught in the Bronx since 1980, but I find that the Puerto Rican students that I've had in the Bronx, and I've had thousands of them, increasingly are less connected to Puerto Rico in terms of being concerned about issues such as this enormous debt crisis. It's something that's so peripheral to their existences, whereas Dominican students are very much connected to these issues of the expulsion of Haitians and the whole race debate that's going on within the Dominican Republic, because they're more recent arrivals.
The Latino community is one that it seems like for 20 years there have been a lot of sort of thumb-sucking about in sort of the political analyst world about, you know, that population as it matured, where it would fall politically. And a lot of that has revolved, I think, around the question of religion and the idea that it's a community where there's a strong degree of religiosity. Obviously, at one point, it was largely considered a Catholic population. But I get the sense, at least from my perspective, that that has changed, that there are other religious groups within the Latino community that have made real inroads. Have you seen, Professor, a change in sort of the kind of faith makeup of Latinos in New York?
With respect to religious persuasion, well, the rise of evangelical movements, the rise of this is not simply something that is simply a characteristic of Latinos in New York City, but it's mirroring what occurs in every country in Latin America. The rise of these evangelicals, and this is a major, major, major force. Now, how that impacts, for example, politics or political ideas or attitudes toward contemporary issues, I can't say for sure.
Again, speaking from my experience, the evangelical community has been very closely aligned with us on issues such as immigration reform, and we've been able to tap into that network rather strongly in order to be able to mobilize our constituencies around issues that we care about. I never listened to evangelical radio, but every time that I go on there to talk about our issues and really talk about the policies impacting the immigrant constituency, I'm always surprised by the level of feedback that I get from people in our base about, like, I heard you. So, like, they have an ability to touch millions of people in the tri-state area that people just sometimes don't even realize. The radio network in particular, it's phenomenal.
And Commissioner, you must work with faith communities in Latina. What role do they play in delivering some of the services and you know, popularizing things like IDNYC?
Yeah, so I think that what Javier mentioned about, you know, we have a large outreach team that is constantly sort of in the field talking about IDNYC, talking about our legal services programs, and always there has to be a faith component of being able to build those bridges with faith communities, because they are absolutely a way in which people have organized historically, right? The civil rights movement was very much kind of faith-driven, and so I think there's that component of our work is just making sure that we are making those connections through community media, through our own outreach, and then this year the mayor also created a faith roundtable, which is really meant to also bring issues up to the administration that we can work on together. So I think they're quite inextricable, and I think the importance of really having a range of different networks for the kind of work that we're doing, whether it's faith, whether it's community organizations, community media, are all very important in getting the word out. So you really don't get more than 800,000 people signing up for IDNYC just by having some ads on the subway. And so it's really about thinking New York is complex, its demography is complex, and the ways in which people get information is equally complex, and so we have to be able to kind of navigate. And that includes now, right, thinking about how do we provide language services in some of the dialects like Quechua, and how do we start to really respond to some of these demographic shifts, if you will, that we're seeing, and that's on us as well.
I'm glad you brought up language because I'm a bad sociologist. I just apply experiences from my life and assume that it speaks to some truism. So my Polish grandparents spoke Polish to each other at home so that they could argue in front of us and we wouldn't know what they were arguing about. But my mom and her brothers don't really speak Polish, and I can sing happy birthday, and that's about it. The persistence of Spanish in the home, I wonder, does that seem as though that's an intergenerational thing? Is that about the people my age and younger communicating with grandparents and parents, and therefore maybe it won't persist? Or is that about something else? What does that reflect, the fact that it still is, even though people are capable in English, that they still speak it at home?
Well, I think it's reflective of the fact that Latinos are, from a historical point of view, relatively recent to Brooklyn and to New York City, really, in large numbers. And so what occurs if we examine the process of language and immigration, if we went back to the turn of the century, Italians spoke Italian at home. But you're not going to find very many Italians, people of Italian origin in Brooklyn or elsewhere in New York, speaking Italian at home now. So it remains to be seen whether or not in the future the utilization of Spanish at home will begin to wane. There is very, very convincing evidence among Puerto Ricans that in fact is the case. That when we look at Puerto Ricans and we segment them, which we can do using data, we find that increasingly Puerto Rican families are speaking English at home, and Puerto Rican younger people are speaking exclusively English and not Spanish. So these data that I showed you, I think, are ephemeral. I think we're looking at a point in time, and I think that that's going to change significantly in the future with the longer that different groups are here.
No, I think I agree with that. I think that's third, fourth generations tend to speak Spanish less. That's been the experience of the young people that we work with in all our sites. I think the one thing that is probably a little bit different is the access to media in Spanish is it's easier. The barriers to those media outlets are less so, and I think it's helping in some instances some people be able to hear or practice it somewhat more. But I do agree that for a lot of the younger people and future generations, they'll prefer to speak to you in English, even if they can communicate in Spanish.
So we're moving to the point of the program where we'll start taking questions. So actually, if anybody has an idea of a question, just raise your hand, even if we're in the middle of talking about something else, and I'll come to you next. But I wanted to ask a little bit about the political development of the Latino population, because you mentioned, Javier, that 3 members of the city council from Brooklyn are of Latino origin, and I was looking today, and I think, obviously there's a congresswoman as well. I think it's 4 of the state legislators from Brooklyn are of Latino origin. It doesn't seem, if you were to line it up, that it's proportional to the size of the community, which could be for a lot of different factors. But do you feel as though that reflects a relative lack of empowerment, or are Latino voices heard in the political sphere, just they don't happen to elect people from those communities? I mean, do you feel as though the power that community wields is equal to its share of the population, or are we still developing that?
No, I think we're still developing. I think the one thing that we are trying to tackle is the entrenched political establishment here in the borough of Brooklyn, in the borough of Kings. The political machine here is strong, and it's been a hard group to pierce in order for us to be able to get as much representation. I think in the past, the political bosses of Kings County, the way that they decide is like there's a there's a Brooklyn, there's a Latino seat, and that's it. I check the box. I don't need to do anything else. And then only people could run in that seat, and the only way you could grow was to work through the political machine until you got anointed to be the candidate from that area, and you could run. And I think that's changing drastically. If you probably saw the elections of 2013, most of the people that won that were representative of new constituencies ran insurgent campaigns against the political machine in order to be elected. And I think that's our job to do as Make the Road and other Latino organizations and others, is to really continue to elevate that power and break the barrier that the machine has around our constituencies and be able to have more representatives. You said there's 4 state electeds, 3 of them are in Bushwick, right? Of the 4, the other one is in Sunset Park. So like, we need to be able to have broader representation in all policies, in the council and in the state legislature.
Let me address this issue of politics and political participation. And I'm going to do it at the state level and national level, and very briefly. One of the major problems here is not simply that there's a political machine. It's that Latinos vote at the lowest rates of any major race and ethnic group in the United States as a whole and in New York. Let me give you some very quick data. Less than 50%, 48% of Latinos voted in the last presidential election, compared with 2/3 of non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic whites. Why not? Why? Why such a low rate? The problem is not voter turnout, it's that Latinos don't register at the same rates. Nearly 3/4 of all non-Hispanic whites and non-Hispanic blacks are registered to vote. 58% of Latinos are registered to vote. And that has not changed one iota since 1992. 1992, 48% of Latinos voted in presidential elections. 2012, 48% of Latinos voted in presidential elections. So I would say that it's not simply the establishment, it's that there has been, and I'm going out on a limb here, a dramatic failure of voter registration drives. We hear about it, we see it on the media, we see it on social media, we see it on Univision, we see it on CNN in Espanol, but it's been largely ineffective in raising the registration rate and participation rate.
So I would challenge that somewhat, because what I would say is that we don't have people running for office that are inspirational, that are really captivating the imagination of folks that are truly representative of the constituency. So if the only person that I see that's running for office is that same guy that I've known since he's 20 years old and now he's 40 and has worked up through the ranks, I'm like, same status quo. There's no like energy. I agree with you. We are not doing very well on voter registration, and we need to get better. I think because of what's going on in the presidential elections, we've seen some slight increases, and we got to take advantage of the opportunity right here because of the Donald Trumps of the world and et cetera, to really agitate our constituency to do more and vote more. Because there's appetite to do so, and we have not been able to get there. So I do think it's an issue of voter registration, but I do think it's also an issue of candidate selection that has not been truly representative of the constituencies that people then aspire and support.
And I will also sort of throw into the mix what I tried to say earlier, which is there's voter registration, voter turnout, but then there's also just this level of political organization, which maybe I'm just envious as an Asian American, but seeing sort of how much more organized, frankly, Latinos seem to be politically, right? There's a special conference, SOMOS, right, where that happens in Albany, it happens in Puerto Rico. We don't have anything like that, right, for Asian Americans in terms of political engagement. There's incredible amounts of, I mean, the Latino vote itself, certainly nationally, but in other ways is very important. There's a really good chance we could see a Latino vice presidential person on the ticket, and I think that's the kind of thing that feels like, even though there's low voter registration, even though there may be sort of other reasons why folks don't come out to vote, that there is something pivotal that's happening with Latino political power and level of organization that is worth taking note of. And I do think that what's happening in the presidential right now with Trump, but also lots of other folks, will actually ensure a degree of alignment of Latinos in a particular political way that will hopefully keep things like immigration reform on the agenda moving forward.
Obviously, part of being able to register to vote is being eligible to be a citizen, and I just want to set you up to talk briefly about the initiative that was unveiled today, which, when successful, if successful, will probably give Brooklyn a few more Latino citizens.
I sure hope so. Yeah, absolutely. So in New York City right now, there are 650,000 people who could become U.S. citizens today, but they haven't. And there's many different reasons for that. Sometimes it's choice, but often it can be cost, and it can also just be the complexity of actually navigating an immigration process of any kind. So today, we announced a partnership with libraries to provide citizenship legal assistance and financial counseling in library branches across the city. And the goal here is to bring down some of the barriers and facilitate citizenship. The libraries, each one of the branches all across the city already have New American corners where you can get information about citizenship. This just takes that effort one step further in terms of actually providing lawyers who can walk through the application with you. We didn't really intend for it to be unveiled on primary day. It just sort of happened to coincide that way. And obviously one of the biggest benefits of becoming a U.S. citizen is the ability to vote. And I think the job is on all of us to sort of think about how we tighten that link between naturalization and civic engagement and participation, because I think it hasn't been done as well as it could, and I imagine it would really influence things like voter registration in the Latino community. I think Mexicans are the biggest population nationwide that need to naturalize and haven't yet, and so I think there's a lot of opportunity there.
When that happens, there, as I mentioned earlier, there's been a lot of speculation about what the political characteristics of an engaged and empowered Latino electorate will be. And one assumption that you hear from people in the Republican Party and on the right is that Latinos are naturally socially conservative, that once you get beyond the pocketbook issues that Javier has talked about, that they would be less likely to support abortion rights or gay rights, that they would feel more comfortable with traditional Republican positions on that. Is that a canard? Have we seen any evidence, anecdotal or otherwise, to suggest that the community has a particular leaning when it comes to social issues? Because that's one of the assumptions that's out there. Javier, have you seen any evidence?
Well, you know, like Make the Road New York, we're representing the totality of the Latino population. So we represent everybody that's part of that community. We probably have the highest concentration of transgender individuals that are Latinos that are part of our institution. And we probably have a lot of evangelicals. And I think what we're trying to do is be in the same space with the same clarity of vision about, like, we cannot create systemic change in this country unless we all band together. And we've been able to process that and feel that to create positive change. Of course, there's tensions, there's opportunities for us to talk about it. But in general, I think there's more alignment politically about how we see the world and how we want to change it, even if there are some disagreements on some social issues.
So, it could be your turn if you want it. Anybody have any questions for our expert panel or observations? Must be something.
When you say Latino could be a vice presidential candidate, that wouldn't be a Cuban, I hope.
Oh, yes, actually, I did not mean that.
I've seen a couple of reports on poverty and education among Latinos, and it always comes in that Puerto Rican population has been here the longest. Now, they may have just come recently, but they're not progressing as quickly or haven't progressed as quickly as later immigration waves. Mexicans being the last ones in are progressing. And I think what the problem is that the more successful immigrants move on. They leave, especially if they're citizens, they leave Brooklyn. Back in the 80s, I'm from Sunset Park. Back in the 70s it was, I had a Puerto Rican secretary, and she said the only reason she was working so she could buy the house in Staten Island, get out of Brooklyn, have her kids go to school somewhere else. And that became a generational problem in the 80s, really, wherein the next generation would not take the local homes, which might have been a brownstone, because they just wanted to get out. They had bad experience with the schools, and they just wanted to get out of Brooklyn. They wanted to raise their kids anywhere but there. And Puerto Ricans have done well everywhere. But the ones who remain are probably the elderly who are impoverished, and New York City is an assisted living community for a lot of people. So they have no choice but to stay, and it skews the numbers in terms of poverty, because they can't get out. They're stuck here, and but they're also being supported here because the city is very generous with them.
Let's react to that. I mean, that's a good question, actually. There is this idea that groups traditionally have come to the city to kind of get a foothold and then moved on. Obviously, there's a new urbanism that's kind of turning that on its head for some populations, but is that aspiration there in the Latino community? And Javier, some of the people who have moved to, you mentioned Allentown and Rockland County, some of that presumably is because they've been driven there, but is some of that driven by folks' own aspirations to get out and have a different kind of life?
Yeah, I think the dynamics has changed drastically from the 1980s. I think a lot of people were trying to leave Brooklyn in that moment, and it was more economically as you could, you left. I think the way I experience it now is mainly people are being displaced and they want to stay in Brooklyn and are unable to afford it anymore and are being displaced and moving to other parts of the country in the population that I work with.
Let me comment on, because I work with this data all the time. You're absolutely right. If we look at the tri-state area, the New York metropolitan area, we look at the surrounding counties, we look at Long Island, we look at Fairfield, Connecticut, we look at Rockland, Westchester, we look at the New Jersey counties contiguous to the city. About 56% of the total Latino population of this region lives in the city. Another 44% lives outside, and that is growing. Now, who's going to the suburbs? If they're suburbs, there are two parallel processes this is not a simplistic process that's going on. One is successful people who have higher educational attainment levels, higher income, can afford to live in suburbs and own their own homes. That's something that is very, very clear. But it's also well known that the suburbs have been emulating processes, socioeconomic processes that we find in urban areas. That is, the suburbs were once lily white, they now have become just like cities. And so we also have pockets of poverty among Latinos living in counties surrounding New York City. So two things. People are leaving because they're being displaced. People are also leaving because there's success stories. Puerto Rican population is a case in point. The successful Puerto Ricans, they've been here the longest, leave the city. This is an ongoing process. And if you look at the Puerto Rican population of Rockland County, Westchester County, even Fairfield County in Connecticut, it continues to grow. So it's part of an ongoing organic historical process of change.
Other questions? Sir, wait for the mic if you would.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. Are there any statistics regarding the intermarriage rate of Latinos with other ethnic populations?
Absolutely. And the whole concept of Puerto Rican and Dominican is going to change radically over the next 20 years because of the fact that people who are labeled as Puerto Rican often have Puerto Rican mothers, Dominican fathers. There is a real mingling of different Latino nationalities. And so this whole concept of Puerto Rican, what is a Puerto Rican? That's going to change. Marriage patterns are very interesting to examine. 42%, I'm sorry, but I work with this data on a constant. I run a project called the Latino Data Project when we dredge up numbers. Over 40% of Puerto Rican adult women are married to non-Hispanic whites. New York City, all right? And that is quite a remarkable statistic. at least according to census data. This is an anthropological, sociological phenomena. Puerto Ricans who've been here the longest, we find that marrying non-Hispanic blacks is less frequent. Puerto Ricans marrying other Puerto Ricans is declining. They're not only marrying non-Hispanic whites, but they're marrying Dominicans or other Latinos. And so this organic process, this ongoing process of how do people choose partners, how do people choose who they form families with, one of the key ingredients is seeking someone of the same educational attainment level as opposed to the same race or ethnic or national origin background.
The question of will a Latino culture, will a kind of distinctive Latino stamp remain in some of these neighborhoods, not only under the threat of gentrification, but given intermarriage, given people, I guess, assimilating more into American life. Javier, that must be something you think about, right? And Bob, I wonder, is that something on the minds of Latinos in Bushwick, that obviously everyone wants success, everyone wants to make it here, but people probably want to hang on to who they are. How do you see that happening? How can you have the increased economic integration and hopefully political integration and not lose the other stuff? Is that possible?
I don't know. I think it's an anxiety that we are living with in Brooklyn. You know, the level of the economic pressures on our neighborhoods is so vast and is moving so fast that like folks are leaving or being harassed to leave. You know, and it's hard. I think that some of the tension is the people that are coming in are wanting to have some of that culture, but are some of the economic drivers of why the people are leaving. So like that tension of like, they want to have those guys in the neighborhood playing dominoes, but because they feel like it's cool, but like they really are they're elevating the rents at a faster rate that, you know, folks like that are not able to live in the neighborhood. So we are constantly thinking about that, and how do we, you know, what's our long-term history in that neighborhood? You know, Bushwick was predominantly Germans, and then Italians, and then Puerto Ricans, and now Latinos, and who knows what's next. And I don't know if we can ever say that that neighborhood will stay like that forever. And I just don't think we have a comprehensive solution towards that. And I think it's the evolution of this city that some of those enclaves might not longer be there.
Commissioner, is that something that policy can contemplate? I mean, a lot of what you do is about helping people establish a foothold, protect their right to stay here, be part of the New York City economy. Retaining cultural identity, can that be part of how you approach these problems?
Yes and no. So I think there's important work. The mayor has a very comprehensive affordable housing plan that is trying to keep New York City affordable for people to be able to live, including immigrant and Latino families. And so I think that's obviously an important policy intervention. I think ways in which we can support people, there's a sort of a range of different ways of creating inclusion. And I think the reason I would say no is I think there's a very big downside, and I agree completely with Javier about the displacement of communities and the ways in which that changes neighborhoods. I've seen that in my own neighborhood. And I also think that there's a lot, I think one of the things I love about New York City, and I particularly love about my job, is there are so many different people from all over the world mixing up with one another, and that also leads to incredible creativity. I think that leads to good cultural exchanges, and frankly, I think for many people also the ability to feel free of being able to find the partner who's right for you and not necessarily needing to just sort of stay within your community, however that may be defined sort of ethnically or racially. And I think that's an incredible part of New York, and against the backdrop of what's happening right now in Europe, where people are really losing their minds about refugees coming that are very different from their sort of traditional culture. It's really nice to be in a place like New York, where I think we've been doing that historically for a long time. So the question is really, how do you maintain the good parts of the sort of mixing and engagement that we have in a place like New York, and at the same time basically don't displace or wipe out communities? And I think that's where things like affordable housing, but a range of other sorts of social and economic policies can be very valuable.
So I think I have one last question for us to end on, and this series of neighborhood conversations is really rooted in geography and also creating not just an hour-and-a-half program to kind of get our city nerd on, but also to equip us to better understand and experience the Brooklyn that we live in or love. And so I want to put everyone on the spot for one quick recommendation. If you wanted to, as a respectful visitor, to taste or hear or smell or see what you think is the heart of Latino Brooklyn, and you could get on a subway now and go to it, what is your recommendation? Where should one go to see this and to feel it and try to understand it on a visceral level?
Make the road.
A corner, a park, a place? Sure. Where would you go?
I would say my office. And I'm not kidding. I feel like the way that we work is that we organize around issues, and each night we have an organizing committee that comes together to talk about those issues. Averages 75 to 100 people. And we talk about, on Mondays we talk about education, on Tuesdays we talk about worker rights, on Wednesdays about housing, on Thursdays about LGBTQ. And we have 75 to 100 people coming together that night in Bushwick talking about that issue and its impact in the community. And not only do we talk about it, then we break bread, and then we actually cook a home-cooked meal. Our members come in and use our kitchen and cook, and then and I feel like it's probably the best rice, beans, and chicken you can get in the neighborhood, because the other ones are now $20 a plate. So if you all would want to come visit Make the Road, we would love to have you one night, and you guys get to talk to our members and really share the experience of what it is to be a Latino in New York.
I would wholly support that and suggest you go also to Make the Road to understand sort of what's at stake in some of the conversations we've been having today, right? And why it's important to sort of preserve spaces like that and communities like that. The other thing I would throw out there in Brooklyn is a music venue called Valdes. And it's not a Latino venue, but there are incredible performances, especially by Colombian musicians, that are world-class performances, really from all over the world. But I think that would be one other place I would suggest, and that you can just stroll in, get a glass of wine, and hear really the best music from so many different parts of the world, including Latin America.
And Professor, any recommendations?
I defer to my distinguished colleagues.
Well, thank you very much to the panel, and thank you to all of you, and especially to the Historical Society, one of the best destinations to check out in Brooklyn. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Have a very good night.
Thank you. Thank you, Jarrett.